Sodom and Gomorrah were once prosperous cities, full of beauty and wealth, yet they were completely destroyed because of their extreme wickedness. Despite their outward success, these cities were hiding dark secrets that led to their downfall. But what exactly did they do to bring about such destruction? Let's uncover the hidden sins of Sodom and Gomorrah and explore what really caused their tragic end. But wait, before we dive fully into this, take 2 seconds and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on our future amazing content, and hit the like button. The most hidden sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. 1. What were the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah? The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah have long been known as a symbol of unimaginable wickedness and divine punishment. While the Bible highlights sexual immorality as the primary sin associated with these cities, their moral corruption ran much deeper, revealing a darker reality beneath the surface. Sodom and Gomorrah's sins were not confined to one type of immorality. Yes, sexual perversion, particularly homosexuality, was rampant, but the true nature of their sins went far beyond the physical acts. In Genesis 18:20, God describes the cries from these cities as having grown so loud that he could no longer tolerate them. Their sin had reached its boiling point, a combination of violent indulgence, selfish desires, and a disregard for divine law. The people weren't just committing forbidden acts, they were living in defiance of righteousness itself. Imagine a city where every moral compass is shattered, where evil is woven into the fabric of daily life. In Sodom and Gomorrah, perversion was not just a private act hidden away in dark corners, it was normalized. Sin had become so widespread and deeply ingrained that it no longer seemed abnormal or shameful. People reveled in their defiance. When visitors arrived, instead of showing hospitality or kindness, they were targeted, assaulted, and violated, as if cruelty was a form of entertainment. The city's moral depravity was a direct rebellion against God's design for humanity. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah embraced not only sexual sin but also a mindset that completely rejected the idea of righteousness. They saw no need for virtue, no need for justice, and no need for mercy. In their minds, every act of corruption was justified by their own desires. But it wasn't just sexual immorality that led to their downfall. Their entire society had become a breeding ground for all types of evil. In Ezekiel 16:49, God calls out their pride, excess, and indulgence, pointing to how they ignored the cries of the poor and vulnerable, showing no compassion, only self-interest. Their moral compass had been so corrupted that they couldn't even recognize the evil in their midst. 2. The rise of pride and arrogance. Sodom and Gomorrah were not just cities filled with sin. They were cities dripping with excess and luxury. The land they occupied was described as well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord. Genesis 13:10, a paradise of abundance. From a distance, the city seemed like the perfect place to live, a haven of wealth, comfort, and power. But beneath this shimmering surface lay a deep and festering rot. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah became intoxicated by their own prosperity. They didn't simply enjoy their wealth, they flaunted it, using it as a symbol of their superiority. They believed they were untouchable, beyond the reach of any judgment. As they grew richer, they grew prouder, and this pride blinded them to the suffering of others. The poor, the orphaned, the oppressed, none of them mattered in the grand scheme of things. Sodom and Gomorrah had everything they needed, so why should they care about anyone else? The Bible makes it clear in Ezekiel 16:49 that their pride and arrogance were at the heart of their destruction. They had become so consumed by their own success that they turned a blind eye to the needy. Despite living in a land overflowing with abundance, they had no compassion for those who struggled. They hoarded wealth, indulged in luxury, and ignored the pleas of the suffering. This selfishness was not a momentary lapse, it was the heartbeat of their society. In their pride, they had no room for humility, no space for generosity, and no willingness to open their hearts to others. Instead of being grateful for their blessings, they saw themselves as entitled to everything, believing that their wealth and power made them better than the rest of the world. This toxic arrogance led them to mock those who stood for justice and righteousness, and in doing so, they mocked God himself. 3. Engaging in adultery and deception. The sin of adultery was rampant in Sodom and Gomorrah, but it wasn't just about broken marriages or acts of unfaithfulness. It was about the culture of deception that flourished in these cities, a culture that normalized lying, cheating, and manipulating others. In Jeremiah 23:14, God condemns the prophets of Jerusalem for engaging in adultery and leading the people astray, comparing them to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. This illustrates how adultery wasn't just a private sin. It was intertwined with a broader pattern of deceit and wickedness. In Sodom and Gomorrah, adultery was not merely an act of betrayal. It was a reflection of a corrupt society that had no regard for truth or integrity. People lied to one another, deceived their neighbors, and justified their immoral actions. The cities were filled with self-serving individuals who used others for their own gain, without remorse or shame. They twisted the truth to fit their desires, making sin appear acceptable and even desirable. Imagine a world where every promise could be broken without consequence, where loyalty was a forgotten virtue, and where personal integrity was a rare commodity. In such an environment, relationships became shallow, trust was non-existent, and the very fabric of society began to unravel. In this culture of dishonesty, adultery wasn't just about betrayal, it was about creating a reality where truth no longer held any power. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah had deceived themselves into believing that there was no need for moral boundaries. They used their power and influence to manipulate others, turning sin into a norm. The lies they told were not just personal but institutional. The leaders, the prophets, and the people themselves lived in a web of deceit. They covered up their sin with lies, painting a picture of righteousness when in reality they were sinking deeper into wickedness. As the deception grew, it became harder to see the truth, and the cities descended into chaos. What they didn't realize was that by embracing these lies, they were sealing their own fate. The cities were doomed not just by their actions, but by the falsehoods they lived by. Oh, and by the way, I know you're liking this video already. Go ahead right now and show me some love by hitting the like button. Done. Alright, let's continue. 4. Openly sinning without shame. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was not just hidden behind closed doors, where it could be ignored or overlooked. No, it was flaunted, displayed openly, with no sense of guilt or fear of repercussion. The people of these cities had crossed a boundary that few dare to reach, where shame and repentance no longer exist. In Isaiah 3:8-9, the scriptures speak to the pride and defiance that grip the hearts of these people. Their deeds are like the deeds of Sodom. They do not hide it. What makes this so terrifying is that the people didn't feel the need to hide their sin. They paraded their transgressions as badges of honor, as though sin was something to be proud of. They mocked righteousness and scorned any attempt to call them back to virtue. Their disregard for morality became so entrenched in their society that they felt no shame in the face of their wickedness. Instead of seeking repentance or at least covering their evil deeds, they boasted about them as if they were victories to be celebrated. Imagine a city where every act of injustice, every moment of immorality is done in the light of day for all to see. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah lived like this, unapologetic, unrepentant, and entirely indifferent to the consequences of their actions. In their minds, they were untouchable, above reproach. The once conscience-stricken human heart was gone, replaced with a callous indifference. What once might have been hidden behind closed doors, whispered about in the shadows, was now broadcast to the world. Their actions became a spectacle, a display of how far humanity could fall when it abandoned all moral boundaries. And with every boastful sin, their connection to the divine weakened, bringing them closer to destruction. 5. The absence of righteousness. When Abraham learned of the Lord's intention to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he pleaded for mercy, asking God to spare the cities if even a handful of righteous people could be found. The negotiation began with 50, and as Abraham continued, it spiraled down to a desperate hope for just 10. But even at that final point, the cities were found wanting. There were no righteous men or women to be found. Not even a small remnant remained to stand in the gap. This moment reveals the utter moral decay that had overtaken the land. A city that was once full of life, perhaps even of potential, had become a wasteland of sin. The people had not only turned away from God, they had hardened their hearts to the point that no goodness could take root. The absence of righteousness wasn't just the absence of good people, it was the absence of any moral compass, any spark of virtue. They had become so immersed in their sin that there was no longer anyone who cared enough to even plead for mercy. When Abraham asked if the cities would be spared for the sake of 50 righteous people, he thought of those who might still be fighting for justice, for love, for truth. But as the count dwindled to just 10, the reality set in. There was no one left. The cities were a reflection of a culture that had embraced sin to such an extent that they no longer even remembered what goodness looked like. The decay had gone so deep that no one could offer a prayer for salvation. And without even 10 righteous souls, the cities were doomed. This absence of righteousness isn't just a historical fact. It's a haunting warning. A society that loses its moral compass and turns away from goodness is bound to face the consequences. The spiritual death of Sodom and Gomorrah was not just in their destruction. It was in their inability to recognize the need for change, for repentance, for hope. 6. Lot's story. A warning. Lot's story is tragic not only because of the physical destruction he faced, but because it underscores a deeper, more personal tragedy. Lot, a man described as righteous in the midst of a wicked city, chose to settle in Sodom, drawn by its material wealth and prosperity. But this choice came at a terrible price. The allure of the city's riches and its apparent success clouded his judgment, leading him to a place where sin and destruction would inevitably catch up with him. Imagine the inner conflict that Lot must have faced. On one hand, he was a man who knew right from wrong, someone who had lived under the protection of Abraham's faith. On the other hand, he was seduced by the city's wealth, by the comfort it promised, by the material pleasures that surrounded him. The problem wasn't that Lot was evil. It was that he allowed himself to become comfortable in a world that was becoming increasingly corrupt. He chose to live in a place that was far from God's heart, where the very air seemed to reek of moral decay. When the two angels visited Sodom, Lot was found sitting at the gate, a place of prominence. This wasn't just a simple observation. It symbolized his level of involvement in the city. Lot had become part of its leadership, part of the system that upheld its wickedness. His role in the city's politics and commerce meant that he was tied to its sinful ways in ways that he may not have even fully realized. He had, in a sense, become numb to the sin around him. But when the angels arrived, the depravity of Sodom could no longer be ignored. Lot, known for his hospitality, attempted to protect the angels from the violent, lustful mob that gathered outside his door. His act of kindness was commendable, but it also highlighted the magnitude of the city's sin. The fact that he had to protect these visitors from the very people he lived among showed how far the city had fallen. Lot's story serves as a chilling reminder that living among sin does not make you immune to its influence. Even the righteous man can be slowly swallowed by a corrupt world if he chooses to stay too long. Lot's escape came at a cost. He lost his wife, who turned back to look at the city she loved, and his daughters, who later showed signs of having been affected by the city's influence. The price of Lot's decision to dwell in Sodom was not just his physical survival, but the emotional and spiritual scars that would stay with him long after the city was gone. Lot's experience teaches us that the world we choose to live in has an impact on us. Even the most righteous can be tested by their surroundings. It is a reminder that the choices we make about where we live, who we associate with, and what we expose ourselves to can shape us in ways we never anticipated. And if we're not careful, the darkness around us will eventually creep into our own hearts, just as it did with Lot. In conclusion, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a warning. While these cities were filled with beauty and abundance, their moral corruption led to their ultimate destruction. Their sins were not only about sexual immorality, but also about pride, arrogance, selfishness, adultery, deception, and the open flaunting of sin. This ancient story is still relevant today, reminding us to live according to God's instructions, to care for the needy, and to avoid the sinful behaviors that led to the downfall of these cities. Sodom and Gomorrah's hidden sins serve as a powerful lesson that we should not ignore. Let us have your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for joining us. If you found this information enlightening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content about cities and cultures from around the world.